All right. Well, let me just say a couple words of welcome to everyone. We're excited to see you all. And we wanted to sort of continue this tradition of art meets science, which those of you who have been associated with the lab for a while know that this is a program we started back in 2011, really as a way to explore or expand the conversation about science and society, about creativity and sort of how that happens. And so over the years, we've had a variety of different ways to engage folks in that conversation. This is an event that we organize specifically for the members of our Star Point Society, partly just as a way to continue that initiative. Thank you all so much for joining us. And we're really privileged to have Dr. Haller, who in addition to being an amazing nephrologist and scientist, also is a passionate lover of art and really art history. And so he has a background in that. And he has done an amazing job of sort of marrying those two things. And being able to look at some of these early artists and their works and connect the dots for us a little bit in terms of what does that history of early science look like, and how did early scientists learn about things like, you know, the human body and anatomy and all of that. So I want to just turn things over to him because I think you're going to really enjoy his perspective on that conversation. Sort of what can we learn from these Renaissance era artists, and what lessons are they continuing to teach us today about what we know about science and medicine. So Dr. Haller, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you, Terry, for the very kind introduction. Yes, we'll talk about art and science. And I have to admit, when I first started with these lectures a couple of years ago, I mostly used medical diagnosis as an excuse to talk about artists and art. And this was a nice mixture, but this has grown over the years, and you'll learn today that we will talk to and with one artist and one painting, telling us about the painting, obviously, and telling us also about the times, and astonishingly, telling us about science. By the end of the talk, you will be astonished to learn, and I hope it will convince you that from this painting, and I'm going to share my screen, hopefully successfully. So before I start, I think I have to mention the people I owe this part of my career, so to speak, and these are the art historians who taught me. It was the late Otto von Simpson, when I studied in Berlin, who introduced me first to Netherlandish art. He was in Chicago before that during the war and is known for his specialist in Gothic art. But then it was also Christian Klampt and Christian Tümpel who introduced me to Rembrandt specifically. And I learned a lot. We traveled together. We saw quite a few Rembrandts in Berlin in the museum. And I wrote manuscripts, not on Rembrandt specifically, but on Netherlandish art. In addition to that, I couldn't give this talk without the readings, and there are especially two I would recommend for you. And they do this much better than I will do this. And this is, on the one hand, Svetlana Alpers from Stanford. And on the other hand, it's Simon Schama. With his insights into Rembrandt and Rubens, without his insights, the talk would not have been possible. So we'll talk about one painting. You see this here, you see the young Rembrandt. The Rembrandt on the left-hand side, you see, is about 22, 23, and the painting was done before, which is here on the right-hand side, was done before he turned 30. So we'll talk about his career in 1632, the young Rembrandt in Amsterdam. And you know that Rembrandt had a long life, and he is the master of self-portraits. And here are some of them, and it would be a lot of fun to talk about his self-portraits and talk about his life, but we'll try to focus on this one painting and this one point in his career. So that's the painting. We'll come back to this painting over and over during the next 50 minutes or so, and it's called The Anatomy of Dr. Tulp. We can easily identify Dr. Tulp. Most likely he is the man with the hat on, and the other ones are students, not very young students, and they are watching and listening. And then we have a remarkable dead body on a table in the middle of this lecture. The painting was done in 1632. It's now in the Mauritshuis in the Netherlands, in Den Haag, but it hung for a long time, for almost 200 years, in where the Surgeons Guild, and this is what this is all about, the painting. It's the surgeons from the Surgeons Guild in Amsterdam, and they ordered the painting, and then it was hung there in their guild house, and you'll see this in a moment. So we see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 live people on the painting, and they are very much alive, aren't they? And we'll talk about this in a minute, that this is one of the liveliest, if not the lively group portrait which was painted in the 17th century, but I'll come to this in a moment. We'll talk about the background of the painter, we'll talk about the painting, we'll talk about Dr. Tulp, a little bit about the surgeons. It is obvious that these are portraits, and this is what they paid for. When they ordered the painting, it was clear that each of them would pay 100 guilders, which was not a small amount of money, in order to be portrait and to be recognizable for people when they came to the guild house and they looked at this painting and said, oh, see here, and we'll come to their names in a moment. Before we do this, we have to position Rembrandt and the painting a little bit in the Netherlands. And the Netherlands were a small country. To be honest, they just had become a country, and it was still unstable, because since 1558, for more than 80 years, the Netherlands were at war with the Spanish monarchy. It was their war of independence. In 1581, they had declared independence from Spain, and although they were not fighting all the time, Leiden, for instance, the city Rembrandt came from, there was a siege in 1574, the dikes were open, and a lot of the Spanish soldiers were drowning. And a lot of people died in Leiden. So for 80 years in this small country, which is smaller than Maine, there were troops and fighting and movement. And here you see the big assembly, quite impressive, of the Netherlandish provinces when they declared independence. Nonetheless, they also had time to fight over principles of religion. You are aware that 100 years before that, Martin Luther had started with the Protestant movement. So we had this schism in the Catholic Church, and the Netherlands were Protestant. They were still Catholics, but the Protestants were fighting between them. And Johann von Oldenbarneveld, who was a hero in the beginning of this war, was first tried and then executed in Den Haag in 1618 because of power, yes, but mostly for religious reasons. And at the same time, the Dutch became a world power. This small country mostly muddy, with a few cities in there, and as I said, smaller than Maine and far less inhabitants conquered the world. This is one of the maps made and drawn in the Netherlands at that time. And it was one company, the East Indian Company, which made this big empire all around the world. So it was all about trade, and the Dutch were very good at that. The English had opened some of this, but the Dutch had taken over, and they were only later in the 17th century beaten by Great Britain. Here you see in red some of the provinces, and the Indonesian provinces, for instance, were only returned in the 60s of the last century. And on the right-hand side, you see New York City, and some of you may remember, and this is the letter written on this occasion in 1626, the Dutch met the Native Americans on Manhattan Island, and they talked for a while, they handed over presents, they got presents, and the Dutch walked away with the impression that they had bought Manhattan. I don't think that the Native Americans actually had the idea that it was possible to sell Manhattan. And the Dutch stayed for 60 years, then they realized that the Native Americans were not going to move, and they had other problems. And then Peter Stuyvesant, who was the last governor, Dutch governor of Manhattan, moved away. So they ruled the world, and Amsterdam was the center of it all. This shows you the harbor of Amsterdam, still a famous city, but at that time, you can see it here with a bird's view, it was rapidly growing. They built the famous canals in Amsterdam. A lot of people got very rich because you can see that the city extended into areas where there are now houses, no houses at the moment, and you can imagine there was quite a lot of money to be made, not only in trade, but also in real estate. It shows you the growth of the city. And this is the East Indian Company. This is the ships they built there, and you see one of the builders of these ships in one of Rembrandt's paintings. So this is the background. There is Amsterdam. There are lots of new houses in Amsterdam. The inhabitants rose from 30,000 around 1600 to almost 100,000 in 1632. And there was a lot of culture. The Dutch loved painting. So there were more than 300 painters in Amsterdam at that time, and almost every household bought paintings. Some of them on the marketplace, some of them from famous painters, and some from art dealers. And this gives you a background for this famous painting. So this painting was done in 1632. Rembrandt was born in 1606, so he was young. It was not his first, but one of his first paintings in Amsterdam. And the question is, who is Rembrandt? Rembrandt was born in Leiden. That's only half an hour south by car from Amsterdam. It was a day trip at that time, and his father was a miller. And this shows you aspects of Leiden, what it looked like. The income of a miller was quite good. There were, if you would have this at the time, middle class. Rembrandt had quite a few siblings. 3 survived, 7 died in early childhood. He had a good training. He went to school, and then he went to the university. Leiden had a famous university, the first university founded in the Netherlands. They have a very famous medical school. I have to admit, I'm a little bit proud. In 1995, they asked me to become professor in Leiden. And then I said, no, I stay in Hanover, which I don't think was a mistake. So, let me see. And they had professors. And they were fighting also about religion. These are two famous professors. Some of you may know Jacobus Arminius, because he was the founder of the Arminianism, which is now the Methodist Church. So John Wesley is a direct descendant of the thoughts of Arminius. And he was professor in Leiden, and he was Calvinist, but he was more liberal. On the other hand, Franciscus Gomarus, he was very strict. So they fought each other, and they lectured not only in the city, but all through the Netherlands. And the big question was, how strict should you be? And in Leiden, they were very strict. This was university. In Amsterdam, they were a little bit more relaxed. And this is, I think, one of the reasons that Rembrandt went there. However, he started as a painter. He left university, and he became first a young painter in Leiden. This is one of his first self-portraits, relatively small. And you see these hairs. He looks more like Bob Dylan with dark, shadowed eyes. Cool, in a way. When you look at that, it's very nicely done. It's a great piece of art. When you look at the hairs he did, when you look at the shadows, this is, as the art historians know, influenced by Caravaggio, dark eyes, a very special self-portrait. And he painted together with a friend, and the friend was Jan Lievens. And they were competitors and friends. And they worked, we know this from descriptions at the time, day and night. Here you see a self-portrait of Jan Lievens on the right-hand side, quite impressive. And on the left-hand side, a portrait of Rembrandt done by Jan Lievens. So you can see that the two were working closely together. Some say they shared a studio, but this is not clear. And then these two, they chose the same subjects. Here you see a wonderful painting of Rembrandt from the Metropolitan, old man with a turban, and that's a different story why they used models like this, but you can see how competitive and how friendly they were. And then they were discovered, so to speak. They were in this small town. They were already locally famous, but Rembrandt painted himself here in a small painting, which is one of the most famous paintings he did. It's very small. It's 9 inches, 9 and 10 inches. And you can go and look at it in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. I have to admit, I missed it 2 times because it's so small and it's right in the middle of the room that you walk by. And at the end of your visit, you ask yourself, hell, where is this famous Rembrandt? You look at this painting and it's a portrait, the artist in his studio, so most likely it's Rembrandt. And on the first glance, it's so small and it looks not that much. But then you look more carefully, and I can tell you, and we'll talk about this, everything about painting is in this small painting Rembrandt did when he was less than 30 years old. He stands there in the background. In the middle, we have this big painting. We can't see what's on it, but it's obvious the painting is the most important part of the whole picture. In comparison, the artist is relatively small, dressed in a dress, which is a mixture of worn out and somewhat more stylish. But around Rembrandt are all the things he needs to paint. You can see the palettes hanging on the wall. You can see this big grindstone where he made the colors. You can see that he held in his hand. And his hands he's very proud of, because this is what makes the painting. But then, in addition to that, when we look more carefully, we can appreciate that although the painting looks very subdued, it's very arrogant. Because he paints, when you look, for instance, here, very diligently how the wall crumbles. So on the one hand, he's telling the world, see, this is where I live, and see, this is how I can paint this. When you look at the floor, when you look at the worn out wood, when you look at the door, this is great art. This is done very diligently and something Rembrandt is very proud of. When you then go and look at the painter himself, the most astonishing thing is that before, you have seen in this self-portrait that this was very dark, and here, this painter has no eyes. Where we expect that there would be lively eyes, and I can tell you in a moment how great Rembrandt was in painting eyes, he has two dark holes, telling us the eyes are not that important. It's the painter. It's what the painter thinks about the painting and how he thinks about the design of the painting. And then one last very important line in this painting is the white line you can see in the middle. You know, this is a fine, thin line, very white, and everybody at the time understood immediately what this meant. Because there was one of the most famous painters of antiquity was the painter of Alexander the Great, called Apelles. And Apelles learned one day that he had a competitor in the Greek Isles, and he went there and visited him. And he arrived, and he was not at home. So he took a brush, and he made a very thin line on one of the paintings, and then he left. And then his competitor came back, looked at the line and said, oh, Apelles is here. And this is the line Rembrandt has drawn here, to compare himself immediately that he is as famous, or could be as famous, as the most famous painters when he was not even 30 years old. And then, as I already mentioned, they were discovered. They were discovered by this man here. This is Constantine Huygens. He was Secretary of State in the Netherlands. He had a very excellent education. He studied in England. He was friends with the English crown. His father already had been Secretary of State in the Netherlands. And he wrote what I always find impressive, a diary every day for his wife. For over 16 years, every day in Latin, he wrote down what happened and just to let her know what he was doing, because he was not at home all the time. Very interested in art. He translated John Donne. He was, and we'll get back to this, very familiar with research going on at the time in Britain. And then he discovered Rembrandt and Jan Lievens. And he was so impressed, despite all his experience. One of his friends was Rubens, that he immediately said, these two will be more famous than all the painters in Italy and Spain and wherever they live. He wrote extensively about the two because he was stricken. He was most stricken by this painting, which is Judas repenting, returning the 30 pieces of silver, and you can see the 30 pieces of silver here on the floor. And this Judas was so impressive, so alone, so desperate, that Huygens wrote a whole letter just about this small painting. It's now in England in private collection, and asked Rembrandt to paint for him and for the court. You can see here a lot of expression, and this is what Rembrandt was famous for when he was so young, and this is what he took with him when he went to Amsterdam. He then left Leiden and he started a career in Amsterdam. His friend Jan Lieven left Leiden as well, but he went to London. And he worked for the British Crown for a while before he returned to the Netherlands. But Rembrandt chose the capital. And he associated himself with the art dealer Eulenburg. Eulenburg ran a big business in paintings, and he looked for the contracts, and the painters painted, and he got the money, and then he paid the painters. But it took not very long before Rembrandt became independent. And the people who wanted their portraits were many in Amsterdam. And one of the most famous, and this is his first painting in Amsterdam, is Nicolaas Roots. You can see with one glance what the profession of Nicolaas Roots is. He's a merchant. What is he dealing with? I mean, how does he make his money? He's selling sable. So this painting was done, and you have to look at this when you're in New York City. It's in the Frick collection. It's a very famous painting, and you can appreciate, hopefully here on the screen, but also when you stand in front of the painting, that how well Rembrandt was able to paint sable and to paint the face of this merchant. He gives the impression that he's active. I mean, he holds this piece of paper. Would you trust this man with money? Because that's what he's asking for. He wants you to invest in his business. This is what the painting is all about. And this is, I think, why J.P. Morgan bought it 100 years ago for his private collection. But it is not only a stiff portrait. The Nicolaas Roots is moving. One hand, he's holding this chair. With the other hand, he's presenting this piece of paper, or he has just taken it from you. And when you look at his face, that's more difficult to see. His eyes are a little bit bloodshot. He looks serious. He looks like he wants to talk to you, or at least there is some interaction going on. And this is, I showed you already the Judas painting, what Rembrandt was famous for. That's a second portrait. He not only painted merchants that Johannes Wittenburger, he was involved in these religious discussions, very fighter for religion. And you can see this, he was 74 years old when he was painted by Rembrandt. And this drama, or how Rembrandt was able to dramatize, this is also present in the Anatomy of Dr. Tulp. Here, all these 8 people on the painting are interacting, and they're all doing different things. They are individualized, they are portrait, but the way they behave and what they do is very individual. As I said, the painting was hanging in the building called De Waag, That's at the Newmarket. This was the house of the Surgeons Guild. This was not the first painting of an anatomy, but you can appreciate how modern it was and how dramatic it was when you compare it to others. This has been painted 30 years before. This is also the Surgeons Guild, and this is historically very interesting, but compared to the dramatic painting we have from Rembrandt, this is more boring. You can recognize the individual, and even a couple of years before, this is also another anatomy. Now here the lesson is not anatomy, but osteology, a little bit more vibrant, but nonetheless still very horizontal and not interactive.
Dr. Haller?
Yes.
Can I interrupt you for a second? I'm not sure we're seeing your slides advance all of a sudden. We're still on the 30 pieces of silver.
No.
Yeah. I'm not sure why. Okay, that one just changed back to the anatomy. There we go.
So can you see the changes now?
Yeah, I just saw you flip through.
Okay. So this is what I was just talking about. This is Rembrandt. This is anatomy 30 years before, horizontal, and all people are recognizable, but more boring. This is the osteology lecture done 10 years before, also very formal as compared to what we see here. And here you see the surgeons. I've put the names in here, so we know their names. There were many more surgeons, obviously, in Amsterdam, but these were the ones who wanted to pay. So in order to be on the painting, you had to pay your 100 guilders, and the other said, well, we're not going to spend this money, so this is why we have these surgeons. The surgeons were in a different guild from Nicholas Tulp. Nicholas Tulp was a medical doctor, and the surgeons were in a guild where sharp instruments were made, and they were responsible for taking care of fractures, of removing things from the skin. They were responsible for bloodletting, and they had their own guild and their own education. They were highly appreciated, but patients were sent to the surgeons by the doctors. The third group which was involved in medicine was pharmacists, and they had their own guild as well. So Nicholas Tulp was chosen by the Surgeons Guild to be their main lecturer on anatomy and on medical things. So he gave regular lectures, but only once per year, the open lecture, the open anatomy lecture, which is displayed here. And when we look at, and I mentioned this before, how different they watch what's going on, you can see that each of them is involved, but not only in what Dr. Tulp is doing, but they look in very different directions. Actually, all of them look in different directions, and most astonishingly, Dr. Tulp, because he's not looking at the arm, at his experiment, as we'll see in a moment, but he's looking far away. However, he explains with his hand what's actually happening with the tendons he's touching with his instrument. So he's actually showing in an experiment what's going on and how the hand moves. But where do they actually look at? They look, most of them, at this book, which is on the right-hand side. Now, so far, you may not have even seen that, but there is a big book, and most of the students, so to speak, look into this book. One of them, Hartmann's Harman, he actually looks at the piece of paper and he only looks up and then tries to concentrate on the experiment. So, and I'll come back to this, this is a discussion of what you can read in books and about experiments, about what you can actually do. And I can tell you in medicine, this is still a big issue. I was Dean of Medical Education for a couple of years, and this was early 2000s, and all the students were into practical medicine. We want to do the real thing. We want to touch patients, and no books. If possible, no books at all. And this is 1632, and the discussion is the same. Do you watch what Dr. Tulp is doing, or do you read the things in the book? I think because we are running out of time, I can see this. I just wanted to come back to this movement as compared to the more old-fashioned paintings, and this is another guild. This is the famous night watch, as it was hanging in Amsterdam. And you can see on the right-hand side, the more old-fashioned, and then on the left-hand side, this is the famous night watch. And it's very different. It's very active. And here on this painting, you can see this is even more vibrant than the anatomy of Nicholas Tulp. Here you can watch for hours, and you can stand in the Rice Museum and look at this painting. Now let's get back to Dr. Tulp. Talking about science and talking about medicine, it's important to realize that Dr. Tulp studied in Leiden. He was born with a different name. He only named himself Dr. Tulp because the house he was living in had a tulip over the front door, and then he chose this as his signature. And in Leiden, he studied with Peter Paul, famous anatomist, and they learned two things. They learned anatomy, and then they learned about herbs, and they learned about pharmacy, because they were the ones who were actually prescribing the drugs, so they had to understand this. And this famous garden, university garden, is still in Leiden. When I was there, they showed me around. They're still very proud of this garden, and it has a very long history. And on the right-hand side, you see the anatomical theater in Leiden. So this is where he studied. Then he came back and he started his practice in Amsterdam. He was seeing patients in the morning, and in the afternoon, he made house visits, house calls, but he also worked scientifically. In 1935, he was the first one who made a list of all the medications which were available in Amsterdam at the time. He made a catalog. He made recommendations for prescriptions in that. And this book was the basis for the pharmacies for 150 years. On the right-hand side, there is a book he wrote on medical cases, observations in medicine, and he gave it to his son when he studied in Leiden 30 years after he had been at the university. He then became mayor of Amsterdam. His first wife died, and then he married the daughter of one of the former mayors of Amsterdam, and he died at an age of more than 70 years in Den Haag when he was elected into the government. But he trained as a medical doctor, and then he taught the surgeons. The big question is, when we look here, why did he prepare the forearm? Because I can tell you this is not what I regularly did. The body, which we see here, was hanged the day before. And then you had to do the anatomy lesson within a couple of days, because otherwise the smell was really too terrible. So what they did normally, they opened up the abdomen and then the thorax, and then they did arms and legs afterwards. But here, they've started with the arms, and the question is why? We know that the anatomical lectures were big parties. You actually had to pay, and you could eat and drink, and it was very organized. You can see this here when they had opened the abdomen, and this is the anatomical theater in Leiden. So you can see once per year they had a full house. But here it's the forearm. And the reason for that is because Dr. Tulp, as Rembrandt, when he used this one line, you remember, on his self-portrait, he wanted to be connected to another very famous anatomist, and that's the anatomist of all of them, that's Andreas Vesalius. In 1543, he published the first 3 textbooks on anatomy, and you see on the left-hand side the edition in Basel. And he was, as I said, the most famous teacher in Padua. And this was the first engraving, the wood print, you see on the right-hand side. And what is he preparing? The forearm. So this is why Dr. Tulp, perhaps he told Rembrandt, I want to do the forearm. So Rembrandt had to use a forearm, and he had to prepare it together with Dr. Tulp. And when Rembrandt died, he still had 4 prepared forearms in his collection. So all of a sudden, the painting of Dr. Tulp is much more than just these surgeons. We now understand how they were organized and that their teacher was a medical doctor. And this medical doctor had studied in Leiden, and Dr. Paul was actually one of the students of Andreas Vesalius. So Tulp wanted to make this connection. And here you can see this very clearly, and the relationship. But now, there was another forearm. 5 years later, this forearm made medical history. This is a very famous book, if not the most famous in the 17th century. These are experiments by William Harvey, done in England in the 30s, 1638. The experiments were done before that, but the publication is in 1638. And he was the first to describe the blood circulation. He was doing these experiments, and he could clearly demonstrate and try to convince the other medical doctors and scientists that the blood had to circulate. We now know that this was really mind-boggling, doing experiments, and then on the basis of experiments, changing completely the view of the body. Do you know how long it took that these ideas actually were generally taught at the universities? I can tell you that 150 years later, in Göttingen, in Germany, at the university, the medical professors still said William Harvey is wrong. Because the other idea, how the body functioned, came from a famous philosopher, from Descartes. And he said, well, no. We have no circulation. The blood explodes in the heart, then it goes into the periphery, then it disappears, and then it's generated in the liver, goes back to the heart, and then we have a new explosion. Well, you laugh about this chain, but I tell you, for 150 years, that's a pretty long time. This was taught at medical school, not in Britain, because, and this tells you that in the 17th century, when we are looking at Dr. Tulp and the anatomy, that this relationship between what's written in books and what's happening in the experiments, and we see one experiment in Dr. Tulp, that this is how the world was organized, how science was organized at that time. and Rembrandt knew about it. I mentioned this briefly. Constantine Huygens, the person who helped him, discovered him, made part of his career, he was friend with Francis Bacon, and he was friends with other medical doctors who did experiments in London. So there was a lot of exchange between the Netherlands and England. So this was not something at that time separate, that we had painters and we had scientists. We had medical doctors and they made experiments. And you can see a very nice example in the next one. I like this a lot because it's a nephrologist. You know, that's a medical doctor looking at urine. And in front of him, he has a book. But he's definitely not looking into the book. He is looking to find the diagnosis, to find what's wrong with his patient in the urine. So when you walk through the museum in Vienna and you look at one of these paintings, you would think, well, that's nice, you know, that's a medical doctor in the 17th century. No, it's a very clear discussion about the relationship about experimental medicine and what's written in books. And this is, as I've said before, and more books have been written on that, on how science was organized in the 17th century. You can see this here. This is on the right-hand side, a portrait of a painter who worked at the court in Den Haag, but also in Great Britain. And you know what he was famous for? For insects. He was looking through a microscope and he was painting what he could see through the microscope. And that's what made him and the whole family, because his father was already involved in that. And some of you may know another example, and that's Maria Sibylla Merian. You know, you may think, well, she's a woman. She was sitting at home looking at flowers and painting flowers. No, no, no. She was a painter, scientist in the 17th century. In order to find her objects, she traveled far. She went all the way to Indonesia in order to be able to paint there. And what I find very interesting is this mixture of art on the one hand and how science was organized at that time. In the 18th century, then science becomes independent. Then all of a sudden, the illustration of science books are very different from what we see in the painting of Rembrandt. But the way representation of science changes, that's what I find very interesting about the painting. And you can see this here. This is Rembrandt in his later years, a self-portrait, the one I like best, which is now in Kenwood House in London. And on the other side, you see his rooms. And this is science. This is what he did not on the side, but this was actually a part. And then when you look at this wonderful shell and the engraving, which he is famous for, this is what he did as a painter, but at the same time, he tried to understand what was behind it and how the world was organized. But we have come a long way. We are 5 minutes before 6, and I think we went through a lot just looking at this painting of 1632. I think we have learned a little bit about the Netherlands and the historical background, mostly to understand Rembrandt and his time. We have learned about Rembrandt and what he was famous for. I hope we have understood a little bit, and I try to explain this, what he was really famous for. He was great with his hands. He was a perfect painter. And we can see this we saw this on the small painting, which is in the Boston Museum. But he was also great in inventing and bringing things to life, bringing people to life, as we can see here, these different surgeons. Whom do you like best? You know, the ones who look into the book, you think, oh my God, they are the old-fashioned, they haven't understood what's really going on. But most of them do. So perhaps this is also a painting about concentrate more on the anatomical lecture and not so much what's in the books. We will never know about that. But we learned, I think, about experiments. I hope I made you understand that there was not that distinction between science and painters as we have it now and what we expect after the 19th century. But there was more connection. And last not least, when you look at the body, what Rembrandt did here, and we have not been talking about this dead body, he was one of the first really to try very, very hard to distinguish by painting and to find out what dead meat actually meant in comparison to the living. And 150 years later, Joshua Reynolds, the famous painter from Great Britain, head of the Academy, of the Royal Academy, when he first saw this painting, he was impressed by the dead body most. And Dr. Tulp, when he looks far away, he thinks about death and life. So with that, I'd like to end. There would be much more. This is a collection of my favorite paintings. We could talk about Bathsheba on the right-hand side in the Louvre. We could even make a medical diagnosis there, but we will not go into that. There are other famous paintings here, and it would be worthwhile to discuss these paintings. Rembrandt is wonderful. In Philadelphia, you have also wonderful Rembrandt in the museum. Jesus Christ as a young Jew, very impressive. And I'm looking forward to see this in the not so far future. The lecture, I have to tell you, is in the best tradition of MDIVL. Because what we do is we try to achieve the best in science. The research we are doing is really focusing on experiments and understanding the world. But at the same time, we harbor the memory of 120 years of the history of science. And while the representation of science changes, and it was different 120 years ago than from what it is now, our discovery, our spirit of discovery remains the same. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Haller. It was fascinating. I always learn, you know, no matter how many times I hear these lectures, I always learn something new, which is really, really wonderful. So thank you for sharing that with us. I think we have a small enough group that we can probably just ask questions if there are some in the audience, rather than putting them in the chat. Dr. Haller, if you want to maybe not share your screen, we can see everyone on one.
I'll do that. I'll try to do that. It's always
there we go.
Here we go.
And then if folks have questions for Dr. Haller, please feel free to chime in.
And then the good thing is you can ask questions, because I try to find out this afternoon whether dilettante is the right word in English. And Amy told me, well, this makes you look more like an idiot. But I can tell you in the 18th century, dilettantes were specialists. So,
Herman, Dr. Haller, l'homme universel. L'homme universel, not dilettante. Right?
Well, I don't know about that, but
I describe you as that.
For the record, Amy is.
Please feel free. You can see this. I'm enthusiastic both about science and the painting. So the more questions you have, the better.
were there ways in which Rembrandt painted something that I'm interested in science and how people's beliefs were only, it kept being broken by science. That every time that a new scientific discovery comes, there's a revolution, or people are put in jail like Galileo or stuff like that.
Yeah, well, there is a whole philosophy of science and discoveries out there. And when I went to university, I still believe strongly in Thomas Kuhn and his ideas that a discovery takes about 80 years before it's really accepted. And mostly because of the people who believe otherwise, they die. So to be blunt about that. So we make discoveries, and then, as I said, the acceptance, it takes a while. But paintings and art is a very good way to transport new discoveries. So I don't think that Rembrandt, he was interested in the world. He tried to understand the world by painting it. And I mean this literally. So this is why he went out there and he painted nature, and he tried very hard to grasp personalities and to grasp the moment. He's almost, some of these paintings are like photographs of a certain moment where the moment characterizes what's going on. So he thought a lot, and he collected all these things. He collected things. He got broke. He went broke in 1653 because he had spent all his money and bought things.
Fascinating. Dr. Haller, you mentioned the sort of that moment when science became specialized and sort of moved away from this connection, this close connection with art. And I know that's been one of those sort of founding principles that we've talked a lot about when we sort of developed this art and science initiative, to bring those things closer. And I'm just curious, in your experience working with medical students and with others, you know, how you kind of work to try to bring those two disciplines, you know, a little more closely together. I mean, just in terms of your focus on helping people improve their powers of observation and all of those things, where do you find that to be particularly helpful when you're working with medical students?
What I think is most important, to give medical students a historical view where we come from and where we want to go to. And paintings or art helps to make them understand what has changed. But this historical aspect is really very important, because diseases change and our perspective on diseases changes. And the way we display diseases changes. Today it's very different from 100 years ago, and this is where it helps to look at paintings and to make them understand, medical students, that what we do at the moment is very important, and we have to focus on that. And this is really the goal, to improve mankind and to find new solutions to old problems, but also make them understand that every generation has been doing that. Dr. Tulp, I can tell you, when he wrote these books in 1635 about all the medications in Amsterdam, he thought that this was it. I mean, there may be one tablet or the other, and he was right, because for 150 years, they were actually using his book in Amsterdam as a recipe to make tablets and medications. Mm-hmm. And then it's also fun to talk about, you know, other situations. And Amsterdam in 1632, smelly city, loud, terrible, but full of activities and conquering the world. And we can do this. And there will be a lecture in 4 weeks about the Vatican, a wonderful arena of competition and working together. And so I like these examples to illustrate in a way not only what life was like, but to understand the individual paintings in their own right better. And I hope that after our lecture, when you are able to travel to Europe within the next couple of years, you will definitely say, well, Amsterdam is nice, but I have to go to Den Haag, to Mauritshuis, and see this painting with the anatomy.
Well, we're counting on you to give us a guided tour. So when you're ready, we're going to sign up.
I'd love to.
All right, great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us this evening. It was great to see everyone, and thank you, Dr. Haller, for putting together such a great presentation. As Dr. Haller mentioned, our next Art and Science lecture will be held on April 28th, I believe, and that will, excuse me, again, focus on the School of Athens, which is another famous piece of art, and lots of great correlations there, lessons to apply to modern day science and medicine as well. So we hope you all join us. We will send you more details about that in the coming weeks. And if anyone, I know a couple folks mentioned that they wanted to receive future notifications of our lectures. So if you're not currently on our website, on our mailing list, excuse me, you can always go onto our website and sign up for our notifications for our e-news and those sorts of things, and that will put you right into our notification list. So again, wonderful to see everyone, and we hope that you will join us next month for our second in this series. So thank you.